the movement that muscle can bring to bone. Many of you are familiar with the term flex or flexion. That's a kind of movement. It takes a bone to have a certain kind of joint. It takes the muscle to be attached to the bone in a certain way to bring about a flex. Today's lab, I don't know if we'll have time for too much more, is about learning the movements and then learning about the microscopic anatomy of muscle tissue. All right, continuing. If we had any time left, we would get to muscles of the head, neck, and trunk. It's likely that'll have to happen on the 6th, and it's likely that we'll have to do a little bit of the muscle on the 11th, okay? Because of Independence Day, we're running out of time. Okay, so that's the pink sheet for the muscle test. You're seeing on there, if you have it in front of you, there are terms associated with movements. There are terms associated with skeletal muscle fiber and the sarcomere. There are some terms associated with the neuromuscular junction. And then we start looking at muscles of the body. Eye, head and neck, trunk, pecs, rotator cuff, upper limb, lower limb. There's a lot for us to do, but most people have commented that there's all this nice blank pink space right here. There are fewer things to remember. And if you had a rough day today, it's very common for folks to bounce right back onto the muscle test. A couple of things are happening. My students are beginning to recognize that memorization and learning of anatomy takes their efforts. Takes a lot of effort. And by the time test 3 rolls around, most people are getting that pretty straight. Okay? The other thing is that muscles, there's fewer of them that we're going to be learning. There are a lot of muscles, but we'll just be looking at certain ones. Okay? So there is some good news. Most folks come back and do pretty well on the muscle test. Okay?
Sure.
Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and then take a look at what we're doing today. We have less than an hour. We have about an hour. And in that hour, I believe, you'll be able to begin learning the names of movements that are available at joints. Now, I recognize that in preparation for today, you probably did not do any prep in regards to the movements of the body, because you'd have to read about them, get their definitions. So, information regarding movements of the skeleton are shown on pages 136 through 139. What you're going to get there, definitions. What is a flexion? What is an extension? Okay? After you've had some ability to, or time to acquaint yourself with movement names and some definitions, this thing is for practice. Okay? This thing gives us a diagram of somebody doing a bunch of different movements. And it's two-dimensional, and so there's probably a fair amount of confusion as to what the person is actually doing. Okay? On this page, you have a table where you can fill in the name of the movement, and the numbers in the table correspond to the movements in the figure. So you've got to get a little bit of experience with what the name of these movements are. All right, so if you have that handout, open up and take a look at the figure, this person standing here on the right-hand side, and look for movements 6 and 7. You see them on there?
Yeah.
Okay. On the table, 6 says blank of arm at shoulder, and then 7 is blank of arm at shoulder. Now, as best as you might figure, it looks like number 6 is this kind of a movement at the shoulder, and number 7 is the return. And some of our movements are paired. Okay? This kind of movement out like this at the shoulder is called an abduction. ABD, abduction. And to bring it back is called an adduction. Abductions and adductions are paired. Now, who cares, really? Aaron, do you care? Only to the extent that you're graded, correct? All right. Because in order to get an abduction at the shoulder, we must have a muscle that crosses the shoulder joint, that has an origin in a place where, what's that? An abductor is a good one, yes? and then an insertion point that crosses that joint. The deltoid, this muscle here, actually has three parts. The central deltoid, they all insert down on the humerus, but the central deltoid then is the portion of the deltoid that does abduction. Okay? If you find, well, take a look at 19 and 20 on there, and then I'll let you have some time to work on this. So even though the dude is kind of over like this, okay, don't ask me what he's doing, all right? In number 19, he seems to, number 19, the dude is doing this, and in 20, that. This is still the deltoid that is doing this. But now you have anterior fibers of the deltoid that are doing what are called flexions, and posterior deltoid that is doing extension. Okay? So flexions and extensions go together. Now, it's one thing to look at pictures. It's another thing to at least read the definitions. Flexion and extension has two definitions, actually. And then I'll leave you be. The simplest definition of flexion is the angle between two bones will decrease in a flexion. There's my cubital joint, forearm and arm. This is about a 180-degree angle if you remember your geometry. Now it's 90. 90 is less than 180. By definition, that's a flexion. The biceps brachii is a flexor primarily. Another definition then for flexion is a body part is moved anterior to the coronal plane. Coronal plane cuts us into anterior and posterior portions. That's a flex. Body part is moved anterior to the coronal plane. Extension then is the opposite for both. Increasing the angle between bones, moving a body part into the posterior plane. That's why this is an extension, and that is a flexion because of the coronal plane.
Isn't that hyperextension?
Good point, Robert. The term hyperextension does show up in here, and that's a good point. There is a definition for hyperextension, and it is what Robert is saying is, so flexion out like this, and then extension back here, and then hyperextension back there. Flexion of the head, extension of the head, hyperextension of the head. Okay? So, use the guidance up there. Marib and Hohen is a great resource. If you don't have a copy, I can get mine, bring it in. Start understanding the definitions of these movements and try to fill in the table. In about a half hour, I'll go over the table with you, see how you did. Okay? If you finish early, let me know and I'll put you on to something else.